The bell above the door of Muller's bakery chimed softly as Catherine turned the sign to closed, even though the afternoon sun still hung high over Milwaukee's German district. It was only 3 o'clock on Memorial Day 1985, and the Saturday shoppers were still thick on the sidewalks. But Catherine Mueller had a ritual she never broke. 41 years of the same ritual. Every Memorial Day. Without exception, the bakery closed early. Her grandson David stood by the counter, his Marine Corps recruitment papers folded carefully in the breast pocket of his shirt. 19 years old, with his whole life stretched out before him like an unwritten book. He watched his grandmother with curious eyes as she moved through the familiar motions, wiping down the glass display cases that had once showcased Black Forest cake and apple strudel, now mostly empty, except for a few unsold dinner rolls. "Grandma," he said, his voice gentle but persistent, "you never told me why you always close on Memorial Day. Every other business on the street stays open." Catherine paused, her weathered hands still on the cloth. 62 years had etched fine lines around her eyes, but they were kind lines, laugh lines, the marks of a woman who had chosen joy even when sorrow knocked at her door. She looked at her grandson, saw the eagerness in his face, the innocent patriotism of a young man about to wear his country's uniform. "Come with me to the back room," she said quietly. "There's something I need to show you before you sign those papers." David followed her through the swinging door into the small office that smelled of flour and old paper. Catherine reached up to the highest shelf, her fingers searching behind boxes of receipt books and ledgers until they found what they were looking for. A wooden box, simple and plain, with brass hinges gone green with age. She set it on the desk between them and lifted the lid. Inside, preserved like relics of a forgotten war, were the remnants of a life David had never known. Black and white photographs, their edges soft and curling. A faded menu written in both English and German. A small American flag, the kind they used to give to children at parades. And there, on top of everything else, a photograph that made David's breath catch in his throat. A young woman, barely more than a girl, standing beside a man in a German Wehrmacht uniform. They were smiling. Not the forced smile of a photograph, but genuine, radiant joy. The woman was clearly his grandmother, though her face was smooth and unlined, her hair dark instead of silver. But the man beside her, the enemy soldier with his hand resting gently on her shoulder, that was impossible. "Grandma," David said slowly, "is that you with a Nazi?" Catherine's fingers traced the edge of the photograph, touching the image of the young woman she used to be, the girl who had stood in a Wisconsin farmyard beside a man the world told her to hate. "His name was Ernst Keller," she said, and her voice carried the weight of 4 decades of memory. "And yes, he wore that uniform. But before you judge what you're seeing, before you decide what that photograph means, you need to understand something about war, about hate, and about a breakfast that changed everything." She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, David saw tears gathering at their corners. "Because 41 years ago today, on Memorial Day 1944, I served breakfast to a Nazi officer who taught me more about what it means to be American than any textbook, any flag, any speech ever could." David's hand moved unconsciously to the recruitment papers in his pocket. "What do you mean you worked for Nazis?" "Not for them, David. With them. Against everything I thought I believed." Catherine sat down heavily in her chair, the photograph still between them. But to understand why that breakfast mattered, why it shattered everything those men thought they knew about America, you need to know what they expected to eat that morning. She paused, letting the question hang in the air between them. They expected to starve. The words fell like stones into still water. "Let me take you back to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, May 29th, 1944, the night before everything changed. The barracks at Camp McCoy smelled of pine wood and desperation. 300 German prisoners of war, most of them captured in North Africa, Most of them younger than 30 sat on their bunks in the fading light and tried not to think about what tomorrow would bring. In the corner near the window, Hauptmann Ernst Keller sat with his back against the rough wooden wall, a small leather journal open on his knees. 37 years old, his hair already showing threads of grey, his eyes carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with the letter he'd received from the Red Cross 3 months earlier. He wrote in German, his handwriting precise despite the poor light. Sie haben uns gesagt, Amerikaner würden uns verhungern lassen. They told us the Americans would starve us. His pen paused above the paper. Outside the window, the Wisconsin sky was turning the deep blue of late spring, and somewhere in the distance he could hear American soldiers laughing, the sound of their joy foreign and almost offensive in its casualness. Keller had been a teacher before the war, a professor of literature at Heidelberg University, where he taught Goethe and Schiller to students who still believed poetry could save the world. That felt like a lifetime ago. A different man in a different country. The man who had stood before eager young minds and spoke of beauty and truth and the transcendent power of language had died somewhere in the ruins of Dresden. Or more precisely, he had died on February the 13th, 1944, when British bombers turned his city into an inferno and his wife Liesel and daughter Anna into ashes. He didn't know they were dead yet. The Red Cross letter had been vague, speaking of damaged buildings and displaced persons, of records lost in the fires. But Keller knew. In his bones, in the hollow space where his heart used to be, he knew. And still, he wrote letters to his daughter. Every night, he wrote to Anna, telling her about America, about the strange trees, and the incomprehensible language, about the fact that even in captivity, even as a prisoner of a nation, he'd been taught to fear. He had not yet been beaten or starved or treated with the cruelty Nazi propaganda had promised would come. Anna Liebste, he wrote, switching from the journal to a letter that would never be sent. Your father is in a place very far from home. But I want you to know that the Americans, they are not what we were told. They have not hurt us. They have given us beds and blankets and enough food to survive. He paused again, his throat tight. Tomorrow, they say, is an American holiday, Memorial Day, a day they remember their dead soldiers. I do not know what this means for us. Feldwebel Brenner says they will withhold food as punishment, as a reminder that we are the enemy who created the dead they mourn. But I do not think this is true. The Americans, they are strange. They follow rules, even rules that protect us. Across the barracks, Feldwebel Otto Brenner stood addressing a small group of hardcore believers, the men who still thought the Third Reich would rise again, who still believed the propaganda they'd been fed like poison in their youth. Tomorrow they will test us, Brenner said, his voice low and intense. They will offer us food, special food, to make us soft, to make us forget who we are. But we are German soldiers. We do not beg for the enemy's scraps. We do not betray the fatherland by accepting American bribes. Brenner was 28 years old and had never questioned an order in his life. Before the war, he'd been a factory worker in Munich, a man of simple thoughts and simpler loyalties. The Nazi Party had given him purpose, identity, a framework for understanding a world that had always felt chaotic and threatening. Now, even in captivity, even facing the reality of Germany's inevitable defeat, he clung to that framework like a drowning man to driftwood. Niemand isst amerikanisches Essen, Brenner continued. No one eats American food. This is not a request. This is an order. Some of the men nodded. Others looked away. A few, the ones who'd been in the camp longest, the ones who'd already tasted the difference between Nazi promises and American reality, said nothing at all. Ernst Keller closed his journal and tucked it under his thin mattress. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. He had stopped trying to predict the future. The future was where his wife and daughter lived, in letters he wrote to ghosts, in memories that grew fainter each day. All he knew for certain was that in less than 12 hours he would face a choice that would define the rest of his life. He just didn't know it yet. 10 miles away, in a white farmhouse with blue shutters and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, Catherine Mueller stood in her mother's kitchen and tried not to cry. The telegram had arrived 3 hours earlier, delivered by a young man in a Western Union uniform who couldn't meet her eyes when he handed over the yellow envelope. Catherine's hands had shaken so badly she'd almost dropped it. James Mueller wounded, Omaha Beach. Stop. Condition. Critical. Stop. Will advise. Stop. Her brother. Her only brother. The boy who'd taught her to fish in the creek behind their barn, who'd defended her against schoolyard bullies, who'd promised to come home and take over the farm so their father could finally rest. James was 23 years old, and somewhere in France he was fighting for his life. Catherine's mother, Margaret, sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. 50 years old and already widowed once from the First War, the war they'd promised would be the last, Margaret had sent her son off to the Second War with a smile and a prayer and a heart full of dread. "Mama," Catherine said softly, kneeling beside her mother's chair. "James is strong. He'll make it through." Margaret looked up, her eyes red but fierce. "I know he will. Your brother is a fighter. But Catherine, baby, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Tomorrow, when you go to the camp, when you serve those German boys their breakfast." Margaret's voice cracked but held. "I need you to treat them with kindness, no matter what you're feeling, no matter that your brother is bleeding in France because of what their country did." Catherine felt anger flash hot in her chest. "How can you ask me that? They're the reason James is dying." "No." Margaret's hand gripped her daughter's wrist, strong despite the trembling. "The war is the reason. Hate is the reason. If you go to that camp tomorrow and treat those prisoners like animals, like monsters, then Hitler wins. Not because Germany wins the war, but because he turns you into what he is. He makes you cruel. He makes you a creature of hate." "But Mama—" "Listen to me." Margaret pulled Catherine closer, their foreheads almost touching. "I was a nurse in the First War. I saw what hate does. It doesn't just kill bodies, it kills souls. Those boys in that camp, most of them didn't choose this war any more than James chose it. They're somebody's sons, somebody's brothers. And if we can't show mercy to the powerless, to the defeated, then what are we fighting for?" Catherine closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to do that." "You are. You're my daughter. And tomorrow you're going to serve breakfast to 300 men who've been told their whole lives that Americans are monsters. You're going to show them something different. You're going to show them what it really means to be American." Catherine stood walking to the window that looked out over their farm. In the distance, she could see the lights of Camp McCoy, a small city of barracks and barbed wire where enemy soldiers slept on American soil. Tomorrow morning she would walk into that camp with trays of food prepared by her mother's hands. She would look into the faces of men who wore the same uniform as the soldiers who shot her brother, and she would choose kindness. God help her, she would choose kindness. At Camp McCoy, Sergeant Mike O'Connor made his final rounds before lights out, his boots echoing on the wooden walkways between the barracks. 31-year-old Irish-American from Boston, where his grandfather had fled the potato famine and built a new life with nothing but stubbornness and faith. O'Connor had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor had fought in North Africa, where he'd captured some of the very men who now slept in his camp, and had been reassigned to guard duty after taking shrapnel in his leg at Kasserine Pass. He paused outside Barracks 7, hearing the low murmur of German voices within. 3 months he'd been running this camp, and every day he marveled at the strangeness of it. Enemy soldiers fed and housed and treated according to the rules of the Geneva Convention, living better than some American citizens during the Depression. His orders were clear: treat the prisoners humanely, follow the international laws of war, show them that America was not the savage, lawless nation Nazi propaganda painted it to be. Tomorrow would be a test of those orders. O'Connor had grown up hungry. The Depression had hit Boston's Irish neighborhoods like a hammer, and there had been years when the O'Connor family survived on little more than potatoes and prayer. He remembered hunger, the kind that hollowed you out and made you mean. And tomorrow he was going to feed 300 German prisoners a breakfast better than anything he'd eaten as a child. Bacon, real bacon, thick-cut and crispy, eggs 2 per man, toast with real butter, coffee hot and strong, the same breakfast American soldiers ate. The same breakfast that, according to intelligence reports from returned prisoners, was so far beyond what German soldiers received that many POWs assumed it must be a trick, a trap, a cruel joke before the real punishment began. "Sergeant O'Connor." The voice came from the shadows, and O'Connor turned to see Captain Richard Lawson approaching the camp commandant, a man who'd been a lawyer before the war and brought that same rigid sense of order and justice to his military service. "Captain?" "The food is ready for tomorrow," Lawson said. 320 portions. Mrs. Mueller and her daughter have been cooking since noon. Good people, the Muellers. They are. Lawson paused, looking toward the barracks. "Mike, I want you to understand something. What we're doing tomorrow, it's not just about feeding prisoners. It's about winning a war that will continue long after Germany surrenders." O'Connor waited, sensing there was more. "These men will go home eventually," Lawson continued. "Back to Germany, back to whatever's left of their cities and their families. And they'll tell stories about how they were treated, about what America is really like. Those stories, Sergeant, those stories might do more to win the peace than all the bombs we're dropping on Berlin." "You really think a bacon breakfast can change minds, sir?" Lawson smiled, a thin, sad expression. "I think kindness is a weapon we don't use often enough. Tomorrow we find out if it works." In the small cottage at the edge of the camp, the cottage reserved for civilian workers, Catherine lay awake in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Her alarm was set for 4:30 in the morning. In less than 6 hours, she would begin cooking breakfast for an army of enemies. She thought about James somewhere in France, maybe dying, maybe already dead. She thought about her mother's words about mercy and strength and what it meant to be American. She thought about the faces she would see tomorrow, young faces and old faces, scared faces and defiant faces, all of them belonging to men who served the nation that had brought so much death to the world. And she thought about her father, who died when she was 12, killed not by war, but by the lingering effects of mustard gas from the trenches of World War I. Her father, who'd come home from France with lungs that would never fully heal, who'd spent his last years coughing blood into handkerchiefs and telling Catherine that hate was a poison that killed the hater faster than the hated. "Choose love," he'd wheezed on his deathbed, his hand cold in hers. "Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. That's the only way to stop the cycle." Catherine closed her eyes and prayed. Not for strength to hate, not for the power to punish, but for the grace to serve breakfast to her enemies without letting the anger in her heart poison the food on their plates. She didn't sleep much that night. Neither did Ernst Keller, lying in his bunk at Camp McCoy, writing one more line in his journal before exhaustion finally claimed him. "Tomorrow we will see if the Americans are truly different, or if kindness is just another lie we tell ourselves to survive." In less than 8 hours, both of them would discover the answer, and nothing in their lives would ever be the same. The kitchen at Camp McCoy came alive at 4 in the morning, a symphony of clanging pots and sizzling skillets, and the rich, overwhelming smell of bacon hitting hot cast iron. Catherine and her mother worked side by side with three other women from town, all of them mothers or sisters or wives of men fighting overseas, all of them volunteers who'd signed up to feed the enemy because someone in Washington had decided that mercy was a military strategy. Margaret Mueller moved through the kitchen like a general commanding troops, her voice calm but absolute. 3 strips per plate. 2 eggs sunny side up unless they ask for scrambled. Toast on the right side, butter already spread. Coffee poured fresh, not from the pot, sitting on the warmer. Catherine's hands moved automatically, laying bacon in perfect rows on the massive griddle that could cook 50 strips at once. The fat sizzled and popped, and despite everything, despite the telegram about James still folded in her apron pocket, she felt her mouth water at the smell. This was food. Real, abundant, generous food. The kind of breakfast her father used to make on Sundays before the gas ruined his lungs, when the Mueller farm was prosperous and the world made sense. "You thinking about your brother?" Margaret asked softly, cracking eggs with practiced efficiency. "How did you know?" "Because I'm thinking about him too, and I'm thinking about all those boys in the barracks who have brothers dying on the other side of this war." Margaret paused, her hands still. "Catherine, I want you to look at me." Catherine turned, and her mother's eyes were fierce and bright. "What we're doing today, it's not betraying James. It's honoring him. Your brother is fighting for a country that's better than its enemies, a country that treats prisoners like human beings, a country that believes even the defeated deserve dignity. If we forget that if we let hate make us cruel, then James is bleeding for nothing." Catherine felt tears burn hot behind her eyes, but she blinked them away. There would be time for crying later. Right now, there was bacon to cook and a choice to make. She chose kindness. At 5:45, the sun began to rise over Camp McCoy, painting the Wisconsin sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed almost obscene in their beauty. In Barracks 7, Ernst Keller woke to the sound of his fellow prisoners stirring their movements sluggish with the heaviness of men who'd slept badly and dreamed worse. Feldwebel Brenner was already awake, already dressed, already preparing his speech. "Remember," he said, his voice cutting through the morning quiet, "they will try to bribe us with food. They will try to make us weak. But we are German soldiers. We do not accept charity from the enemy." Some of the men nodded. Others looked away. A young private named Franz, barely 19, whispered to the man beside him, "But I'm so hungry." Keller heard the exchange and felt something crack in his chest. Hungry. The boy was hungry, and Brenner was going to use that hunger as a weapon of pride, of loyalty to a regime that had sent children to die in a war they could never win. At 6 o'clock exactly, the bell rang for breakfast formation. 300 German prisoners of war filed out of their barracks and formed neat lines in the compound yard, their faces blank, their eyes wary. They'd been in the camp for 3 months, long enough to know that the Americans followed their rules, that punishments were fair and beatings were forbidden. But this was different. This was Memorial Day, the day Americans honored their dead, the dead that Germany had created. Surely today would bring punishment. Surely today the mask would slip and the true face of American vengeance would show itself. Sergeant O'Connor stood at the entrance to the mess hall, his uniform crisp despite the early hour, his face unreadable. "Gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried across the silent yard, "today is Memorial Day, a day we Americans set aside to remember those who died in service to our nation. Many of those deaths were caused by the country you served." The prisoners tensed. Here it comes, Keller thought. Here comes the punishment. In accordance with the Geneva Convention of 1929, O'Connor continued. "You are entitled to receive the same rations as American enlisted men. This morning you will receive the standard American breakfast. You are not required to eat it. You are not required to like it. But you are required to behave with discipline and respect." He stepped aside, opening the door to the mess hall. "Welcome to breakfast." The prisoners filed in slowly, suspiciously, like animals approaching a baited trap. The mess hall was a long wooden building with tables set in neat rows, and at the far end a serving line where civilian women stood behind steaming trays of food. And oh, the food! Ernst Keller stopped walking when he saw it, and the man behind him bumped into his back with a muttered curse. But Keller couldn't move, couldn't process what his eyes were showing him. Bacon. Mountains of bacon, crispy and glistening with fat. Eggs perfectly cooked, their yolks bright yellow suns. Toast golden brown and dripping with butter. Coffee black and strong steam rising in fragrant clouds. It was impossible. It was more food than he'd seen in a single place since before the war. More food than German civilians had seen in years, more food than German soldiers received even when they were winning. And the women serving it, they weren't guards or soldiers. They were mothers and daughters, regular American women who looked at 300 enemy prisoners and smiled. Smiled. Catherine stood behind the bacon tray, her hands steady on the tongs, even though her heart was hammering in her chest. She'd served the first 50 men without incident, watching their faces transform from suspicion to shock to something that looked almost like grief as they realized the food was real. Then Ernst Keller reached the front of the line. Their eyes met, and for one suspended moment neither of them moved. Catherine saw a man in his late 30s, his face too thin, his eyes carrying a sorrow so profound it was almost visible. Keller saw a girl barely out of her teens with dark hair and strong hands and eyes that held both grief and determination. 3 strips, Catherine said, her voice automatic. Or you can have more if you're hungry. Keller's English was halting but clear. This is real. This is what you eat. This is what we eat. This is what American soldiers eat. This is what you eat too, because that's the rule. She placed 3 thick strips of bacon on his plate, added 2 eggs, a slice of toast. Keller stared down at the food like it was a miracle or a curse, he couldn't decide which. Behind him, Feldwebel-Brenner's voice rang out sharp and clear. Niemand isst, nobody eats. This is a trap. And in that moment, in that single crystalline moment of choice, Ernst Keller realized that his entire worldview hung in the balance on a plate of American bacon. Everything he'd been told about America, about Americans, about the necessity and righteousness of the Reich, it all came down to this. Were the Americans the monsters he'd been taught to fight, or were they something else entirely? Keller picked up the plate and walked to an empty table. He sat down. He looked at the bacon, at the eggs, at the impossible abundance of it all. And across the mess hall, Otto Brenner watched with eyes that burned with fury and fear, because he knew that if Keller ate, if their Hauptmann, their captain, their leader broke and accepted American kindness, then the dam would break and nothing would ever be the same. The entire mess hall held its breath. Ernst Keller picked up a strip of bacon. He raised it to his lips. He took a bite and tasted the end of everything he'd ever believed. The taste of bacon hit Ernst Keller's tongue like a memory made solid, like every Sunday morning of his childhood condensed into a single strip of crispy meat. His mother's kitchen in Heidelberg, the smell of pork fat rendering in her grandmother's cast-iron pan, the way little Anna used to steal pieces before they were cool enough to eat, burning her fingers and laughing. Keller closed his eyes and tears spilled down his weathered cheeks. He wasn't crying from sadness. He was crying because the bacon tasted exactly like home. And that made the propaganda a lie. And if the propaganda was a lie about something as simple as breakfast, then what else had been a lie? What else had he believed that wasn't true? Across the table, young France watched with wide eyes. 19 years old, drafted at 17, sent to North Africa, where the sand got into everything, and the British tanks came out of the sun like avenging angels. France had been hungry for 2 years. Properly hungry, the kind that made you weak and desperate and willing to believe any promise of food. The smell of bacon was torture. "Hauptmann," France whispered in German. "Is it safe?" Keller opened his eyes, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and looked at the young private. Such a boy, really. Still had acne on his cheeks. Probably lied about his age to enlist, thinking war was glory and honor instead of mud and blood and watching your friends die for inches of worthless ground. "It's bacon, Franz. Just bacon. The same bacon we ate in Germany before the war made us forget what real food tastes like." Franz's hands trembled as he reached for his own strip. He bit into it carefully like it might explode. Then his face crumpled, and he started to sob great heaving cries that shook his thin shoulders. Around him, other prisoners watched with growing desperation, their resolve weakening with every second. The dam broke. 15 men reached for their food simultaneously, some crying, some laughing, some eating in grim silence, as if accepting defeat. The sound of 300 men eating breakfast should have been ordinary commonplace, but in that mess hall it sounded like surrender, like the moment when an army realizes the war is already lost and all that's left is to decide how to lose with whatever dignity remains. Feldwebel Otto Brenner stood frozen in the serving line, his plate empty, his face contorted with rage. He watched his men, his fellow soldiers, his brothers in arms betray everything they'd fought for, over bacon, over American bacon served by American women on American plates in an American prison camp. "Verräter!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "Traitors, cowards, you disgrace the fatherland!" But his men kept eating, and that was answer enough. Catherine watched from behind the serving counter, her hands mechanically placing bacon on plates, while her mind struggled to process what she was witnessing. These were supposed to be hardened soldiers, fanatical Nazis who'd chosen to fight for Hitler's Reich. But they were crying over breakfast like children, and something about that broke her heart and confused her anger and made the telegram in her pocket feel both more painful and somehow less absolute. Her mother touched her arm gently. "You see now," Margaret whispered, "they're just boys, hungry boys who've been lied to." Sergeant O'Connor stood near the door watching the scene unfold with careful eyes. He'd seen combat had killed Germans in the desert when it was kill or be killed, had carried wounded friends while bullets sang past his head. But this somehow felt more like victory than any battle. This felt like winning something that mattered. Brenner shoved his way through the line until he stood in front of Keller's table. He slammed his empty plate down with a crack that made several prisoners flinch. "Hauptmann Keller," he said, his German precise and cold. "You are an officer of the Wehrmacht. You took an oath to the Führer, and you betray that oath for enemy food." Keller looked up slowly, a piece of toast halfway to his mouth. He finished chewing, swallowed, took a sip of coffee. Then he set down his cup with deliberate care and met Brenner's eyes. "I took an oath to Germany, Feldwebel, not to lies." His voice was quiet, but every prisoner nearby could hear him. "They told us Americans would starve us. They told us Americans were barbaric, lawless, cruel. They told us we were fighting for civilization against savages." He gestured at the food at Catherine and the other women serving at the orderly mess hall, with its clean tables and generous portions. "Does this look like barbarism to you? Does this look like cruelty?" "It's a trick," Brenner insisted. "A psychological weapon. They fatten us up to make us soft to break our will." "Our will is already broken, you fool. Germany is losing this war. The Americans are days away from Rome, the Russians are pushing west, and the Allies just invaded France. It's over. The only question is how many more people have to die before someone admits it." The mess hall went completely silent. What Keller had just said bordered on treason, on defeatism, on all the crimes that got German soldiers executed by their own officers. But Keller didn't care anymore. His wife was dead. His daughter was dead. He'd spent 6 months in a POW camp being treated better than German civilians, better than German soldiers, better than he'd treated himself in the last years of the war. The lies were exhausting, and he was tired of carrying them. Brenner's face went white, then red. "You will be reported. You will face court-martial when we return to Germany." "We're never returning to Germany, Brenner. Not the Germany we left. That Germany is burning. What we return to, if we return at all, will be something new. Something that will have to reckon with what we've done, what we allowed to happen." "You're a coward." Keller smiled a terrible, sad smile. "Perhaps. But I'm a coward eating bacon while you starve yourself for a lie. Which of us is the fool?" Brenner grabbed his plate and hurled it across the mess hall. It shattered against the far wall, the crash echoing like a gunshot. Several American guards moved forward, hands on their weapons, but O'Connor held up a hand to stop them. "Feldwebel Brenner." O'Connor said his English slow and clear, so the German could understand. "You are confined to barracks for destruction of government property. You will remain there until further notice. I demand my rights under the Geneva Convention." "You'll get them, after you calm down, gentlemen." O'Connor gestured to 2 guards. "Escort Feldwebel Brenner to his quarters." As Brenner was led away, still shouting about traitors and loyalty and the coming victory of the Reich, the remaining prisoners returned to their breakfast with renewed intensity. Some ate quickly, as if afraid the food would disappear. Others ate slowly, savoring each bite like a prayer or a confession. Ernst Keller finished his coffee and stood to leave. As he passed the serving counter, Catherine found herself speaking without planning, to the words escaping before she could stop them. "Did you like the breakfast?" Keller paused, turning to look at her properly for the first time. He saw a young woman with flour on her apron and grief in her eyes, and he recognized that grief because he carried the same weight. "You lost someone," he said softly in English. "To the war." Catherine's hand moved unconsciously to her pocket to the telegram. "My brother. He was wounded in France. I don't know if he'll survive." Keller nodded slowly. "I am sorry. War takes too much from too many." "Did you lose someone?" The question hung between them, and for a moment Catherine thought he wouldn't answer. Then Keller reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small photograph, creased and worn from being carried close to his heart. A woman with kind eyes and a little girl with blonde braids, both smiling at the camera. "My wife Liesel, my daughter Anna. They died in February when the Allies bombed Dresden. I did not learn this until last month, but I knew. In my heart, I knew." Catherine's breath caught. She'd heard about Dresden, about the firestorm that consumed the city, about the thousands dead. American newspapers had reported it with grim satisfaction, calling it justice for London and Coventry. But looking at this photograph, at this man's dead family, justice felt less clear. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "War is sorry," Keller said. "War is nothing but sorry. But this breakfast, this kindness you show to men who serve the nation that kills your brother, this is not sorry. This is something else. This is hope, perhaps, or mercy. I do not know the English word." "Grace," Catherine said. "My mother calls it grace." Grace. Keller tested the word, rolling it around in his mouth like he was tasting something new. "Yes. Grace is good word. Thank you for grace, miss. And for bacon." He smiled, then a real smile, despite the tears still wet on his cheeks, and Catherine found herself smiling back, and for just a moment the war seemed very far away and very small compared to 2 people recognizing shared grief across the gap of enemy lines. Then, Keller was gone, walking back to the barracks with the other prisoners, and Catherine was alone with her mother and the empty serving trays and the strange, hollow feeling in her chest that felt like understanding beginning to take root where hatred had tried to grow. That night, Catherine lay in her bed in the civilian cottage and listened to the sounds of the camp settling into sleep. Somewhere in the barracks, 300 German prisoners were digesting American food, and maybe, just maybe, reconsidering everything they'd been taught about the nation holding them captive. And somewhere in France, her brother James was either dead or alive, and she wouldn't know which until another telegram arrived or didn't arrive, and the waiting was its own kind of torture. She thought about Ernst Keller's photograph, about the wife and daughter who died in flames while he sat in a Wisconsin prison camp eating better than he'd eaten in years. She thought about the bitter irony of that, about how war made monsters of everyone, even as it pretended to fight monsters. But mostly she thought about his face when he'd tasted that bacon, the way something had broken open in him, and she wondered if kindness really could be a weapon, if grace really could defeat hate. Her mother had said it could. Sergeant O'Connor thought it could. And tomorrow she would go back to that kitchen and cook breakfast again for 300 enemies, and maybe one breakfast at a time, one act of grace at a time, she would find out if they were right. 3 days later, on June the 6th, 1944, the news reached Camp McCoy that the Allies had landed at Normandy. American, British and Canadian forces were storming the beaches of France, and the world was holding its breath to see if the invasion would succeed or drown in blood. In the prisoners' barracks, the news hit like a physical blow. For the fanatics like Brenner still confined to quarters, it was proof that the final battle was coming, that the Wehrmacht would throw back the invasion and show the world German strength. For the realists like Keller, it was confirmation that the war was entering its final phase, that Germany would fight desperately and lose inevitably, and that thousands more would die for a conclusion already written. But in the Müller farmhouse 10 miles from camp, different news arrived with a Western Union telegram that made Margaret scream and Catherine's knees go weak. James Müller. Stable. Stop. Transferred England. Stop. Will recover. Stop. Her brother would live. He would come home. The war had taken its pound of flesh from the Müller family, but it hadn't taken everything. Not yet. Not James. Catherine cried for an hour. Great sobbing releases of fear she'd been holding tight for days. Then she dried her face, put on her apron and went to work at the camp kitchen because 300 men still needed breakfast, and her grief and relief were private things that didn't change what needed doing. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that O'Connor would later describe in his official reports as unprecedented prisoner cooperation and attitude adjustment. The Germans who'd accepted the breakfast, who'd chosen food over pride, began volunteering for work details. Farm labor was legal under the Geneva Convention if prisoners were willing and paid, and Wisconsin needed workers desperately with so many young men overseas. Ernst Keller was among the first to volunteer, which was how, on a bright morning in early July, he found himself standing in the Müller farmyard, learning how to milk a cow from Catherine's mother, while Catherine herself scattered feed for chickens and tried not to stare at the German officer working 20 feet away. "You squeeze gentle but firm," Margaret explained, demonstrating the technique on Bessie the Müller family's oldest and most patient dairy cow. "Too rough and she kicks. Too soft and you get nothing." Keller tried his academic hands clumsy at practical work. The cow shifted irritably, and Margaret laughed a sound so warm and maternal that Keller felt his throat tighten with memory of his own mother dead, 10 years buried in a cemetery that might not even exist anymore after the bombing. "Like this," Margaret said, guiding his hands. "There, you feel the rhythm." He did. And something about the simple animal warmth of the cow, the smell of hay and milk and summer morning, made him feel more human than he'd felt since the war began. Made him feel like maybe, just maybe, there was a life possible after all this ended. A life of ordinary things like milking cows and growing crops and teaching children to read poetry. Catherine watched from the chicken coop and felt that same strange confusion that had plagued her since the bacon breakfast. This man was supposed to be her enemy. His country had nearly killed her brother. His uniform represented everything America was fighting against. But watching him fumble with the milk bucket, laughing at himself when he spilled half of it, listening to him thank her mother in careful English, she couldn't maintain the hate. Couldn't hold on to the clear lines that were supposed to separate good from evil, us from them. He was just a man. A sad, broken man, trying to learn how to milk a cow on a Wisconsin farm while his whole world burned down around him. And somehow that was more dangerous than if he'd been a monster, because you couldn't hate a man for being human. Over lunch, Margaret served the German work crew sandwiches and cold milk, and they sat in the shade of the old oak tree that had stood in the Mueller yard for 100 years. Keller ended up next to Catherine, both of them eating in companionable silence until she finally asked the question that had been bothering her for weeks. Why did you do it? Why did you eat the bacon when you knew it would make Brenner angry, when you knew the other officers would call you a traitor? Keller considered the question, choosing his words carefully in his improving but still uncertain English. Because I am tired of lying, he said finally. Tired of pretending that wrong is right because my country says so. Tired of hating people I do not know because someone tells me I must hate them. He looked at her directly. You ask why I eat bacon. I eat bacon because it tastes like truth. Like the truth that America is not what they told me. That maybe I fight for wrong side all along. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening that she hadn't known was closed. My mother says the same thing. About truth, I mean. She says kindness is how you find truth when everything else is lies. Your mother is wise woman. She's stubborn. Won't let me hate you even though I want to sometimes. Keller smiled sadly. You should hate me. I wear uniform of nation that hurts your brother. But hate is exhausting, yes, takes so much energy. And I am very tired. They sat together in the shade, enemy and victim, prisoner and free citizen. Two people connected by nothing except breakfast and grief, and the slow, painful process of recognizing humanity in places you'd been taught to find only evil. And watching from the farmhouse window, Margaret Mueller smiled and thought about her husband, who'd died from gas poisoning 10 years after the First War ended, who'd used his last breaths to tell their daughter that love was the only thing that could stop the cycle of hate. Maybe he'd been right. Maybe grace really was the weapon they needed most. Maybe one breakfast at a time, one act of kindness at a time, they could win a war that mattered more than all the battles being fought with guns and bombs. Maybe. Summer turned Wisconsin into a patchwork quilt of green and gold, the fields heavy with corn and wheat that needed harvesting, and the German prisoners became a common sight on farms throughout the county. They worked hard, these former enemies, their bodies lean and strong from months of good American food, their faces tanned from the prairie sun. Ernst Keller had become a fixture at the Mueller farm 3 days a week, and Catherine had stopped flinching when she saw his uniform, had stopped thinking of him as a Nazi or a prisoner or even really as German. He was just Ernst, the quiet man who quoted Goethe while shocking wheat, who helped her mother with the heavy lifting she could no longer manage alone, who sat on the porch after work and taught Catherine phrases in German while she taught him the idioms of American English. Your mother makes best apple pie in Wisconsin, he said one evening in late July, savoring the last bite of Margaret's famous dessert. This tastes like hope, I think, Catherine laughed. Hope tastes like apples and cinnamon. Hope tastes like someone caring enough to bake for you, like being treated as person, not as prisoner, as human, not as enemy. He set down his fork carefully. You know what Nazis teach us about Americans, that you are weak, soft, decadent, that your kindness is weakness that will destroy you. And now I think maybe kindness is strength. Maybe treating enemy as human is how you win without becoming monster yourself. This is very American idea, I think. Very strange. Very good. Margaret joined them on the porch, wiping flour from her hands. She'd been teaching Catherine how to make the family's secret pie crust recipe, the one passed down from her grandmother who'd immigrated from Germany 70 years earlier. There was irony in that teaching pie-making, while a German prisoner sat on their porch, but Margaret had long since stopped finding the ironies of war amusing. "Ernst," she said, settling into her rocking chair, "can I ask you something that might be difficult?" "Of course, Mrs. Mueller. You give me food and kindness. I owe you honest answers. When the war ends, when you go home to Germany, what will you tell people about America, about how you were treated here?" Keller was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set over the wheat fields, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him achingly of sunsets over the Neckar River in Heidelberg in the world before everything burned. "I will tell them truth," he said finally. "That America fed us when we expected to starve. That America treated us as humans when we came as enemies. That American mother and daughter showed more mercy to German prisoner than German government showed to its own people." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I will tell them that I learned more about civilization from bacon breakfast in Wisconsin than from all the speeches about Aryan superiority. That kindness is real strength, and everything else is just fear pretending to be power." Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand gently. "Then maybe this war will mean something after all. Maybe enough people tell those stories we don't have to do this again in another 20 years. Catherine watched her mother's hand on Ernst's hand, watched the way he didn't pull away, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. This was what winning looked like. Not crushing your enemy, but transforming them. Not revenge, but redemption. Not hate, but grace. "I got another letter from James today," she said quietly. "He's in a hospital in England. Says he'll be home by September if the doctors are right." Ernst smiled. "I am glad. Your brother, he fights for good cause. For country that believes defeated enemy can become friend. This is worth fighting for." "Were you in combat?" Catherine asked. "Before you were captured." "Yes. North Africa mostly. I see things, do things that I am not proud of. I follow orders because that is what soldiers do. But following orders does not make orders right." He stared at his hands, work roughened now from farm labor. These hands, they held rifle. They shoot at men who did nothing to me except wear different uniform. And for what? For lies about racial purity and national destiny. For evil dressed up as patriotism. "You didn't know," Margaret said gently. "I should have known. I am educated man, professor of literature. I read philosophy, poetry, history. I know that hate is poison, but I choose to believe anyway because believing is easier than resisting, because going along is safer than standing up." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "And now my wife and daughter are dead, and I sit on American porch eating apple pie, and I wonder what I could have done different. What I should have done different." Catherine felt tears burning in her eyes. "You're doing different now. You're choosing different now. Is too late to matter?" "No." Margaret's voice was firm. "It's never too late to choose right. That's what makes us human instead of animals. We can change, we can learn, we can become better than we were." As August arrived and the corn grew tall enough to hide a man, Ernst Keller made a decision that would change the trajectory of his entire life. He asked Sergeant O'Connor for a private meeting in the camp commandant's office, and there, in careful English supplemented by a translated written statement, he did something that half the prisoners would call treason and the other half would call courage. He informed on Feldwebel Brenner's sabotage plot. Brenner and his remaining loyalists had been planning to damage farm equipment, blame the Americans for prisoner mistreatment, and create an international incident that might get them transferred to a harsher facility where they could maintain their ideological purity away from the corrupting influence of American kindness. But more than that, Brenner had been planning to target the Mueller farm specifically to destroy their tractor and possibly hurt Catherine or Margaret, to make an example of the family that most symbolized the collaboration between Americans and cooperative prisoners. "I cannot allow this," Keller told O'Connor, his hands shaking as he laid out the details he'd overheard. "Mrs. Mueller and Catherine, they show me kindness when I deserve hate. Brenner wants to hurt them because they are good people. This I cannot allow." O'Connor listened carefully, took notes, thanked Keller for his information and his courage. Then he set a trap. The next evening, when Brenner and 3 of his followers approached the Mueller farm under cover of darkness, carrying wrenches and wire cutters and hatred in their hearts, they found not an unguarded tractor, but a squad of military police waiting in the barn. The arrest was quick and efficient. Brenner fought screaming about persecution and violation of his rights, demanding justice under the Geneva Convention, even as he'd been planning to violate every principle that convention stood for. His followers went quietly ashamed or relieved, or both. Catherine watched from the farmhouse window as military police vehicles drove away with Brenner still shouting defiance into the night. She'd been in the barn. If Keller hadn't warned them, if O'Connor hadn't set his trap, she might have been hurt or killed collateral damage in Brenner's desperate attempt to prove that ideology mattered more than humanity. The next morning, when Ernst arrived for work, Catherine met him at the gate before he could even enter the yard. "You saved my life," she said without preamble. "I did only what is right." "You betrayed your own men." "No." Keller's voice was firm. "I betrayed lies. I betrayed hate. Those men, they are not my men anymore. They serve something dead, something that should die. I serve something else now." "What do you serve?" He looked at her for a long moment, and Catherine saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch something vulnerable and desperate and honest. "I serve hope that world can be better than what we make it. Hope that German professor and American farm girl can stand together and not be enemies. Hope that kindness is real and grace is possible, and that my daughter's death means something if it teaches me to choose life." Catherine felt tears spill down her cheeks. Without thinking, acting on instinct and emotion, and something deeper than either, she stepped forward and hugged him. Just held him while he stood frozen in surprise, then slowly, carefully hugged her back. 2 enemies embracing in a Wisconsin farmyard while the sun rose over fields that didn't care about nationality or ideology or the stupidity of human conflict. It was Margaret who found them like that, and Margaret who smiled through her own tears and said nothing, just went back inside to start breakfast because some rituals were more important than words. That afternoon, Sergeant O'Connor came to the farm with news. Brenner and his followers were being transferred to Fort Leavenworth, a high-security facility for difficult prisoners. They would spend the rest of the war in cells away from other POWs, isolated in their ideology, until Germany surrendered, and they were sent home to face whatever judgment awaited them there. "Keller," O'Connor said, pulling the German aside, "what you did took guts. You could have stayed quiet, avoided trouble. Why didn't you—" Keller looked toward the farmhouse where Catherine and Margaret were preparing lunch. "Because some things matter more than avoiding trouble. Because I am tired of being coward. Because those 2 women, they give me reason to believe in humanity again, and I will not let hate destroy them." O'Connor nodded slowly. "The war's gonna end soon. Probably by next summer. When it does, prisoners will be repatriated back to Germany. You thought about what you'll do. Go back to nothing. My city is destroyed. My family is dead. My university, my home, everything is ash. I will go back to ash and try to build something from it. Or, O'Connor said carefully, you could stay. Keller looked at him sharply. Stay in America is not possible. It might be. Congress is debating something called the War Brides Act, allowing foreign spouses of American citizens to immigrate. They're talking about extending it to include POWs who marry Americans. Not official yet, but it's coming. The implication hung in the air between them like morning mist. You think I should marry American woman, marry for papers? I think you should marry for love if you find it. And if that love happens to come with American citizenship, well, that's just the government's way of saying thank you for choosing mercy over hate. Keller said nothing, but his eyes drifted back to the farmhouse, to Catherine, visible through the kitchen window, and something in his expression made O'Connor smile and clap him on the shoulder. Think about it, Professor. You got time, but not forever. That night, Ernst Keller wrote in his journal for the first time in weeks. He'd stopped after learning about Anna's death, couldn't bear to keep writing letters to a ghost. But tonight he wrote not to his daughter, but to himself, trying to understand the transformation happening in his soul. I came to America as enemy and prisoner. I expected cruelty, starvation, perhaps death. Instead, I found bacon and apple pie and 2 women who show me that kindness is not weakness, but greatest strength of all. Catherine Mueller. She is young enough to be my daughter, and she treats me with more grace than I deserve. She has every reason to hate me, but she chooses not to hate. This is American miracle, I think. This is why America will win not just war, but peace that follows. He paused, pen hovering over paper, then wrote the truth he'd been avoiding. I think I am falling in love with this country, and maybe also with this girl who represents everything good about it. But I am 40 years old and she is 19. I am enemy prisoner and she is free citizen. I am man with nothing and she deserves everything. How can I even think such thoughts? The answer came 3 days later, when Catherine found him sitting alone by the duck pond at the edge of the farm, staring at the water like it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. She sat beside him without invitation, comfortable enough now in his presence that silence didn't feel awkward. "My mother thinks you're in love with me," she said finally. Ernst's head whipped around his face, a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "Catherine, I never meant to. I did not intend to cause offense. I am sorry if I... Are you... Am I what... in love with me?" The question hung between them like a bird suspended in flight, beautiful and terrifying in its honesty. Ernst took a shaky breath. "You are 19 years old. I am 37. You are free, and I am prisoner. You deserve young American man who can give you normal life, not broken German professor who has nothing but guilt and grief to offer." That's not an answer. "Yes," he whispered. "God help me, yes. I am in love with you, with your kindness, your strength, the way you choose grace, even when anger would be easier. You remind me that good people exist, that beauty survives even in ugliest times. But Catherine, this is impossible. When war ends, I go back to Germany. You stay here and live your life. This is how it must be." Catherine was quiet for so long that Ernst thought perhaps he'd ruined everything, had destroyed the friendship that had become the most precious thing in his prisoner life. Then she took his hand, held it gently, and spoke words that would echo through decades. "My father died when I was 12. Before he died, he told me something I never understood until now. He said love isn't about what's easy or convenient or what other people think makes sense. Love is about recognizing another soul that makes yours feel less alone. Love is about choosing someone and being chosen back, and everything else is just details we figure out together. Catherine, I'm not saying I love you, not yet, but I'm saying I could. I'm saying that when I think about my future, you're in it. And I'm saying that if there's a way for you to stay, if there's a legal way to make this work, then maybe we should try. Ernst felt tears streaming down his face, hot and cleansing, and full of more emotion than he thought his damaged heart could still produce. "The War Brides Act," he said hoarsely. "O'Connor told me about it. If we marry, I could stay. But Catherine, you should not marry me just to give me citizenship. This is backward. Marriage should be for love, not for papers." She smiled then, radiant and sure. "Then maybe we wait. Get to know each other properly. Let me finish growing up a little. Let you heal from your grief. And when we're ready, if we're ready, we make that choice together. Not for papers, not for convenience, but because we choose each other. But if war ends before we are ready, then we write letters, lots of letters. And when Germany is rebuilt and travel is possible again, you come back, or I come there. We figure it out, Ernst. That's what people do when they care about each other. They figure it out." He kissed her, then gentle and careful, and full of wonder that this impossible thing might actually be possible. And Catherine kissed him back, this enemy soldier who'd become her friend, and now maybe something more, this broken man who'd learned to choose mercy over hate. Behind them, hidden in the trees, Margaret Mueller watched and smiled and thought about her husband and the cycle of hate that killed him 10 years after the war that poisoned his lungs had ended. Maybe this was how you broke that cycle. Not with more hate, not with more revenge, but with young people brave enough to love across the scars war carved into the world. Maybe this was grace in action. Maybe this was what winning actually looked like. The months that followed were a strange dance of waiting and hope and the slow work of two damaged people learning to trust the possibility of joy. Ernst continued to work at the Muller farm, but now there were stolen moments by the duck pond, quiet conversations in the evening after Margaret had gone to bed, the careful building of something that looked increasingly like a future. In September, James Mueller came home from the war, 23 years old with a purple heart and a limp that would never fully heal. He was shocked to find a German prisoner eating dinner at his family's table. The first night was tense, awkward, full of long silences and careful words. But Ernst didn't shy away from James's questions or his anger. He answered honestly about his service, about the things he'd done and the things he'd failed to prevent. He showed James the photograph of Liesel and Anna, shared his grief as currency of common understanding. "You're one of them," James said finally, his voice flat. "One of the men who killed my friends. Yes, I am sorry. These words, they are not enough. Nothing is enough. But they are all I have." James studied him for a long moment. Then he saw the way his sister looked at this German, the way his mother treated him like a son instead of an enemy, and he understood that the war had changed more than just his body. "My father died from the last war," James said quietly. "Took 10 years, but it killed him just the same as if he'd died in the trenches. I don't want to spend the next 10 years carrying hate around. It's too heavy. I'm too tired." He extended his hand across the table. Ernst looked at it like it was a miracle, then grasped it firmly. "Thank you," Ernst whispered, "for mercy, for letting your sister teach me to be a better man. Don't thank me. Thank her. She's the strong one, always has been." In November, the War Brides Act was officially extended to include prisoners of war who married American citizens. The paperwork was complex, the approval process uncertain, but it was possible. It was actually possible. On a cold December morning in 1945, 2 weeks before Christmas and 6 months after Germany's surrender, Ernst Keller and Catherine Mueller stood before a justice of the peace in the small church where Catherine had been baptized as a baby. Margaret wept quietly in the front pew. James stood as best man, his uniform pressed and his medals gleaming. Sergeant O'Connor attended with half the guards from Camp McCoy men who'd watched an enemy become a friend through the simple act of shared breakfast. Ernst wore civilian clothes for the first time in years, donated by the church's charity program. Catherine wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. They spoke their vows in English, with Ernst carefully pronouncing each word, and when the justice of the peace said, "You may kiss your bride," Ernst kissed Catherine like she was oxygen, and he was drowning. The reception was held at the Mueller farmhouse, and it was there, surrounded by American neighbors and former German prisoners who'd chosen to stay, that Ernst gave his toast. "I come to America as enemy," he said, his English now fluent though still accented. "I expect cruelty. I expect starvation. I expect to die here, maybe, or at least to lose everything that makes me human. Instead, I find bacon breakfast. I find apple pie. I find two women who show me that kindness is not weakness, but is greatest strength any nation can have." He raised his glass, his hand shaking with emotion. "To America, who defeats me not with weapons, but with grace. To Catherine, who teaches me to live again. And to bacon, which changes my life more than all the propaganda in the world." The room erupted in laughter and applause, and as Ernst sat back down, Catherine leaned close and whispered, "I love you, Professor Keller. Welcome home." "I love you too," he whispered back. "And yes, this is home now. This is finally home." They would have 46 years together, Ernst and Catherine Keller. They would have 4 children and 11 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren by the time Ernst died in 1991 at the age of 84. They would open a German-American bakery in Milwaukee in 1950, serving apple pie and strudel side by side, teaching their children that heritage was something to honor and hatred was something to overcome. Every Memorial Day, they would serve a special breakfast at the bakery: bacon, eggs, toast, coffee. The Freedom Breakfast, they called it. Same meal that changed a life in 1944. And in 1985, when Catherine sat in that bakery's back room and told her grandson David the story of how she met his grandfather, she ended with the same lesson Margaret had taught her all those years ago. "Your grandfather came here as my enemy," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the tears. "He wore a uniform that represented everything America was fighting against. But America gave him bacon grace and a second chance. And he gave America his loyalty, his love, his children and grandchildren who serve this country in military and business and teaching, who believe in American values because those values saved their grandfather's life." David looked at the photograph of Ernst in his Wehrmacht uniform standing beside young Catherine in a Wisconsin farmyard and tried to reconcile that image with the kind, quiet grandfather who'd taught him German folk songs and the importance of mercy. "So when I join the Marines," David said slowly, "I should remember that every enemy is somebody's grandfather someday. Remember that every enemy is somebody's person right now, somebody's father, brother, son. Fight when you must, David. Protect this country and these values. But never forget that mercy is more powerful than revenge, that grace is stronger than hate, and that a bacon breakfast can defeat more evil ideology than 1,000 bombs." She opened the old wooden box one more time and pulled out the final item, carefully preserved in plastic. A handwritten recipe card in Margaret's flowing script: Muller Family Freedom Breakfast, bacon, eggs, toast, coffee, served to everyone, friend and enemy alike. Feed their bodies, win their hearts, win the future. This is how America wins. Catherine pressed the recipe card into David's hands. "Your great-grandmother wrote this the night before she served breakfast to 300 German prisoners." She knew something that took the rest of us years to understand, that the war we win with kindness lasts longer than the war we win with weapons. Outside the bakery, Milwaukee was celebrating Memorial Day 1985 with parades and flags and speeches about valor and sacrifice, all important, all necessary, all true. But inside Muller's bakery, 3 generations sat together and remembered a different kind of victory. The kind that turned enemies into family hate, into love and breakfast, into a weapon more powerful than any bomb. David touched the recruitment papers in his pocket, felt their weight differently now. He would still join the Marines, would still serve his country, but he would serve with his grandfather's lesson carved into his heart, that strength without mercy is just brutality with better PR, and that the truest test of American values comes not in how we treat our friends, but in how we treat our defeated enemies. "Thank you, Grandma," he said quietly, "for telling me this story. Thank you for listening, sweetheart. Now let's close up the bakery and go visit your grandfather's grave. He always loved Memorial Day, said it reminded him of the morning his whole life changed over a piece of bacon." They walked out together into the sunshine, 3 generations connected by a story of grace defeating hate, of breakfast, changing the world, of 2 people brave enough to choose love when war told them to choose otherwise. And in heaven or memory or whatever place the dead reside, Ernst Keller smiled and remembered Wisconsin mornings, apple pie, hope, and the American girl who taught him that kindness was the only superpower that mattered. The bacon breakfast had shattered hate, but grace had built something better in its place, and that, more than any military victory, was what made America worth fighting for. That was what made America great. Not because Americans were perfect, but because Americans believed that even enemies could be redeemed, that even the defeated deserved dignity, and that breakfast was more than just food. Sometimes breakfast was mercy made tangible. And mercy, as Ernst Keller learned on a Wisconsin morning in 1944, was the most powerful weapon in the world.